Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone attending today. My name is Karen Burkhart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We're pleased to welcome you to today's program, Digital Assets, the Changing World of Money. I want to point out a few functions about submitting questions and comments. For those who you will see across the menu bar at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function for general comments that can be seen by all participants. There's also a Q&A function for submitting written questions and a raise hand function if you would like to ask a verbal question directly. We will be deferring questions until after the presentation, so please be patient if you have your hand up. Help me to thank our supporters, the Tiemann's Foundation, Wells Fargo Private Bank, the Richard Petritz Foundation, and Mackenzie Place. And thank you to all of our institutional members, which includes the El Pomar Foundation, Colorado College, the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, Pikes Peak Community College, Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC, SIVA Charter High School, and Fountain Valley School. And welcome to all of these partners who are attending with us here today. As you may have seen, we are honored to be included as one of 78 nonprofit organizations in this year's Indie Give campaign. I'd like to introduce Carol Campbell of Bad Woman Marketing, who is going to briefly speak to you about our participation this year.
Thanks so much, Karen. As Karen said, my company is Mad Woman Marketing Strategies, and I'm working with the World Affairs Council to help them maximize their Indie Give participation. Super excited to be a part of it. What I'd like to do is invite you to make a donation to the World Affairs Council this year. It's definitely been a challenging year for all of us, working remotely, not having opportunities to meet in person. And Karen and Jamie have done a tremendous job of pulling together great resources to continue programs throughout this year. So what I would like to invite you to do is consider that a number of the programs have been free this year. I would love to invite you to consider making a donation similar to what you would have spent on programs throughout the course of this year. The way to do that is visit www.indiegive.com. You can make a donation. You can direct it directly to the World Affairs Council. Of course, there's a number of other worthy charities and organizations on there, but really important for the World Affairs Council to continue to be able to do the incredible work they've been doing. It starts with the members that continue to enjoy the great program. So thank you for letting me have a couple minutes.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our guests from the U.S. Department of State who have brought today's program to us. Irina Karmanova is a public affairs officer in the Bureau of Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Her office strives to maintain an ongoing dialogue with the American public about the important value of diplomacy and its tangible impact on American lives by connecting the State Department with domestic audiences and engaging American people directly. Andrew Zvirdin, who has just joined us via video, is a financial economist in the U.S. Department of State Office of Monetary Affairs. He specializes in digital asset policy and European macroeconomic issues. He has served U.S. embassies in Nicaragua, Canada, and the Marshall Islands. Prior to joining the U.S. Department of State, Andrew was an economist and a city planner. So I will, with that, turn it over to Irina and Andrew, and looking forward to this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here speaking to your lovely members and student groups that you have joining us. It's an honor to be here, and without further ado, I'll show a quick video about the State Department, just a little bit of a teaser of who we are and what we do. Oh, I think the screen sharing is actually disabled for me on my end.
Let's see how I can, hold on just a second here. Okay, is there a way that I can?
No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. I can always send you the link if that would be better.
That would be great. I can do that. Sorry about that, Irina.
No worries. and let me know when you see it. I can send it to everyone in the chat as well.
Okay. Yeah, I've not seen it yet. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you, everybody. Just stand by.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Well, thanks for playing that, and thank you for watching, everybody. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent, thank you. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the emerging world of and changing world of digital currencies. Hopefully the connection is okay. Sort of classic telework environment. Here I am in the office, and the computer functionality with webinars, it does not seem to be as good as it does for us at home. In any case, I always find it fun and interesting to talk about emerging technologies in the Department of State, which is one of the oldest cabinet agencies within the US government. And so we have gone through quite a bit of evolution on this subject and on many other subjects as we confront a very different world. My intention here is to have a relatively brief conversation about how we in the US Department of State are looking at digital assets, the changing world of money. And I hope to have a very fruitful conversation and back and forth during the question and answer period. So please feel free to ask any and all questions you feel interested in for this conversation. I think the best way to start off this conversation is to take a step back and look at what money functions, what its function is at the very beginning, right? In classic Econ 101, we always talk about money as having three primary functions. It's a unit of account, it's a medium of exchange, and it's a store of value. The unit of account basically means how we measure and how we can compare different objects across our entire economy. It's the common language, the common denominator by which we are able to understand the relative values of different objects. The medium of exchange is basically how we can transfer ownership of assets across our economy. And then of course, store of value is the means by which we can retain value and capital over a period of time and across different jurisdictions. Now, for much of our history and much of our economic history, this has been relatively simple. Dollars, whether it be in gold coins or in paper fiat currency, has been the easiest way to talk about money, that it's a unit of account. It's the way in which we talk about US dollars. Everything's denominated in US dollars. Medium of exchange, all I have to do is hand over this paper bill or this gold coin. And then of course, a store of value, the presumption is that even over time, I can keep these under my mattress and they'll retain their value. In the modern world, all of these aspects of money are changing and are being challenged in really interesting and innovative ways. And many of them have pretty dramatic implications for US foreign policy and economic policy overall. Let's go through each of these three just in turn real quick. In terms of a unit of account, one of the things that I find really interesting about this is how we talk about different items in our economy. I think it's safe to say that the US dollar remains the primary unit of account. It's the means by which we translate all other values. Even if you look at modern cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and others, they're almost always referred to in US dollar amounts, or it's almost always necessary to put that in parentheses next to the value of cryptocurrencies or other digital assets. We still use dollar as the primary unit of account. But you're starting to see some interesting innovations even there. Consider, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya and much of Africa, which is using mobile currency essentially and your cell phone as the unit of account. You're exchanging minutes. Minutes now becomes a unit of account in many different countries. Credits within China's Alipay or WeChat system can also be considered a new and emerging unit of account that challenges traditional notions about what is money. On medium of exchange, how do we transfer money from one person to another? Well, I don't know about you, but almost all of us do not use physical banknotes for many of the transactions we encounter in much of our life. In the United States, credit card companies are our primary mechanism by which we exchange. So I exchange my plastic credit card and in exchange receive a service. Technically, no money in the traditional sense was even used in that transaction. But it goes even beyond that as we start thinking about point of sale and API and near field communication. It's a very different way to exchange money between different individuals in our modern world. And then finally, as a store of value, this really changed post-Bretton Woods as you consider the change from the gold standard into the fiat currency into a new and emerging world in which nearly anything can count as a store of value. We imbue value into the different assets that we have. And that class and the categories of assets are rapidly expanding throughout the world, not just in the United States. We've seen each of these three aspects of money be challenged in various ways, but particularly within the last 2 years, I would say, we are seeing an explosion of innovation and an explosion of international challenges to the traditional role of money, and specifically the US dollar in particular. So what are the different ways that we're seeing these being challenged? I think the first one, and perhaps the one that many Americans, many others do not think much about, is a question of a claim versus an object, the type of money we're talking about. The reality, again, is that most of us don't use physical banknotes for much of our transactions. We're already using sometimes what's known as wholesale money or claim money. This is bank money. This is the money that's created by your bank account or by your bank rather, and then all of the transactions occur digitally. We have direct deposit, we have ACH transfers, and all of this is money in the traditional sense, and yet the type is very different than a bearer instrument, that is a physical dollar bill that if I have in my possession, that means I own it. A claim instrument is one in which we have a bank account and you have a claim against the deposits that are held in the bank. This is an innovation that has happened many years before, but we're starting to see it explode in terms of different ways that individuals can claim assets in this digital space. I, for example, do not have, my bank has no physical locations. There's no location that I can walk into and talk to a teller and receive my money. All of my transactions with my bank actually occur electronically and digitally. This has been happening for a while, but it's happened with traditional banks. Now, what about new entrants that are not banks at all, but are financial service providers in different aspects and in different ways? There's the question as well, I think, about who backstops the value of these different assets. When you stop and think that all money has only the value that we give it, traditionally, we have assumed that governments needed to be the ultimate backstop, that it was faith and belief in a currency and in the government's ability to repay that currency that underpinned the value of various currencies. So the US dollar was strong because the US government and its commitment to repay was also strong. Now we're encountering other backstops. We're encountering others who are willing to claim the value and the claims against different instruments. In some ways, this can be centralized or it can be decentralized. So some companies may claim that they are going to be the ultimate backstop of an asset, and others claim that the system itself ensures that the claims are always verified. This is the concept behind a distributed ledger technology and the means by which every transaction is validated through a distributed function. So this is sort of the emerging world that we're starting to see, but it's deeply unsettled. And it's, I think I'm excited because it means we're in an opportunity to really see change and shape change. So in that context, what is it that the US government and the US Department of State are looking at in particular? Well, there's a couple of key categories by which we're trying to sift through the explosion of innovations and new ideas that are emerging in the world of cross-border finance and international financial transactions. I think the first one and the most important one, and the one that you probably hear the most about from the US government, has to do with illicit finance. Our number one concern is to protect the US financial system from illicit actors, from money laundering, and from the financing of terrorism. I think the reason why this is such a high priority is rather evident. We've seen in times past illicit actors across the globe try to use digital finance and various means of financing their operations without going through the US banking system or trying to avoid sanctions or other efforts designed to stop illicit activities from taking place. The US Department of Treasury has the lead on this, and I'm happy to go into some detail, but I am not an expert on sanctions enforcement policy or financial security. But I will say this, that we work very closely with the US Department of Treasury and other actors throughout the US government to do our very best to ensure that transactions that take place adhere to existing regulations and protect the international financial system. It's in no one's interest to have rogue actors manipulating and abusing our existing banking system to fund actions that undermine our various societies and support and encourage behaviors that we do not believe in. And also concerning, we want to ensure that actors that have been sanctioned under US law suffer the consequences of those sanctions under US law and do not avoid such sanctions through digital currencies and other technologies that might be at play. So that's the first one. And again, I'm happy to go into more detail on each of these aspects as it relates to US foreign policy in the question and answer session. I'll just stop on that briefly for now. The second one really came to the forefront beginning with the introduction of the Libra last year, and that is macroeconomic stability. Up to this point, I think the general consensus among many policymakers was that cryptocurrency was an interesting, if out there, concept, that many of the digital assets that were being discussed were only at a pilot stage and were not seen as having a dramatic immediate effect on global international financial architecture. With the introduction of the Libra, central bankers and regulators really confronted for the first time the possibility of a global stablecoin, as they are called, or an asset, a currency that could be used universally across country borders and which could have real implications for the macroeconomic stability of many countries. As a specific example, imagine a country in Africa that has struggled to manage its monetary policy and as a result has struggled with inflation for a long time. With the introduction of the Libra or another digital asset that was a viable alternative to their local currency, their citizens could theoretically adopt in large numbers this new currency, which would, for those individual citizens, be very beneficial because it would be a hedge against inflation. It would protect them against all sorts of financial risks. But for state actors, this could be a real concern because it would prevent them from being able to effectively manage the money supply in that country, to monitor inflation and to take appropriate steps during periods of fiscal or economic stress within the system. The costs and benefits of such a new model had not really been weighed at a global scale. We've been working and dealing with many countries that have dollarized, for example, that have adopted the US dollar instead of the local currency in order to avoid some of the risks associated with inflation and weak monetary policy in different countries. But what do you do if it's an instrument that is international and that is outside of the control of any government regulators? So as you saw, the Libra announcement in 2019 really sparked a wide-ranging conversation about how do we think about the macroeconomic stability implications of many of these new emerging technologies as they relate to the international financial architecture. I think our third priority as we're looking at this area and thinking through the foreign policy implications is has to do with the US business sector. How do we ensure a level playing field in this world of emerging technologies and new ideas and new innovations? We want to ensure that there's a level playing field that allows US companies to compete and engage in this new area, to set the rules and to set the standards by which everyone can play together without creating a lowest common denominator, rush to the bottom type of regulatory world. And so to do that, we want to make sure that there's a broad international cooperation about the rules of this game and the rules in this emerging technology. Now, this is very difficult to do because, as I sort of mentioned at the very beginning, definitions are very fluid. What counts as money now? Does Western Union count as money, or is that just simply a money remitter? Does M-Pesa count as money? Who can be the financial regulators when it goes across so many different sectors and involves very different types of technologies? I think one of the encouraging sides of this new technology, and one that is very heartening for US policymakers beyond US industry approaches, is the opportunity to include so many more people into the global economy. More than 30% of all citizens, of all people throughout the world, have no bank account, have no access to the formal financial system. I believe it's about half of adults make a non-cash payment in the world. The other half are still using cash for all transactions in their local economy. Digital tools have a real opportunity to increase financial inclusion in real and meaningful ways, and I'm happy to go into more detail about some specifics. I just wanted to note, for example, that the Bahamas just launched its new central bank digital currency with the explicit purpose of including citizens in its country that had never had access to the financial system prior to their new digital currency, which they're calling the sand dollar, which I think is fantastic. But what this tool does is it allows people in remote islands who have smartphones or who have even regular phones to now have a means of exchanging, of storing value, and of having a denomination that is secure that they otherwise would not have had, and that they would have otherwise had to simply store physical banknotes in their mattress, essentially. So I'm really encouraged by the opportunities that are available for financial inclusion as a result of digital assets, and happy to go into detail there as well. One of the less reported aspects of digital assets out there, I believe, has to do with energy. When you look at the statistics about how much energy and electricity is currently being expended for transactions, for digital asset transactions, it's really astounding. Just as one data point that I often like pointing to, Bitcoin mining consumes more electricity than the entire country of the Philippines right now. So that is just the process by which you're validating transactions for Bitcoin. That takes more energy and more electricity than all of the Philippines put together. That has obvious, large, and significant climate change issues. It has to do with sustainability, and it has to do with the effective allocation of electricity. Would there be more efficient means and efficient uses of this electricity than validating long chains of transactions on the blockchain? So that's something that we're looking at and working with foreign partners quite extensively on as well. And then finally, the other point that I would say that we are really focusing on in the US Department of State on this issue has to do with fraud and consumer protection. The amount, I guess, in any Wild West environment of innovation and new ideas, it is very prone to abuse, to manipulation, and to outright theft. And we see that across the board. We see that particularly, for example, with US citizens living abroad. They're often looking for cheaper and more efficient ways to transmit money back to the United States or from the United States. And unfortunately, we see them very often being victims of fraud, of losing access to their e-wallets and to their online transactions. Related to this too, we're really looking at digital identity, which I think is an emerging aspect of digital assets, and that has a lot of promise. you know, way back in the day, we had MySpace, and anyone could create a MySpace, and anyone could claim they could be anyone. Facebook came along and they suggested, hey, we're going to have to actually tie your account to an email address, or to your college email address in particular, as a means of validating that you were who you said you were. As we've developed since then, obviously there are still means of becoming anonymous and avoiding validation online. But wouldn't it be great if we had a means of truly validating individuals in an online environment? That would have great implications for the security and the sustainability of our digital assets and our ability to engage in commerce and transactions online and in a digital environment as well. So I'm very hopeful, again, that we have some emerging technology and tools there, but at least in the current Wild West environment that we find ourselves when it comes to digital assets, one of our real concerns is protecting consumers and protecting their data as well. Not every country in the world thinks about privacy in the same way as the United States and many in the Western world. So for that reason, I guess I'll use this as a segue to give one broad foreign policy perspective as it relates to these issues, and that is China. As many of you probably know, China is working right now on a digital currency and payment system. They're piloting it in several cities. And the United States is very concerned by the approach that they're taking because of these types of questions related to consumer protections and related to privacy. The intention of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China is not to ensure a level playing field with transparency in transactions and facilitating a cheaper and more efficient global payment system. Their purposes are different, and they include collecting information and retaining that information for their own purposes. So we do have a bit of a challenge in terms of sculpting that global narrative about what comes next, and about how we approach these emerging challenges as they relate to digital assets and the new world of money. I'll stop there. I think that's a sort of my big overview. Maybe just let me mention one final aspect of this, and that is maybe as a hook for some potential questions hereafter, central bank digital currencies. As a result of Libra, and I think because of a growing awareness of the value of some of these new digital currency opportunities, central banks around the world are working at a remarkable pace to invest in what are known as central bank digital currencies. These could be the best of all worlds, centralized tools that reduce transaction costs and enable central bankers to manage control of the macroeconomic stability, while also facilitating online and digital transactions and lowering trade-related costs and cross-border transactions as well. Over 80% of all central banks in the world right now are currently researching different types of central bank digital currencies, also known as CBDCs. And it's really promising, the research that they're coming to. Even the Federal Reserve announced just last month that they are working on a pilot with MIT and with others to develop a CBDC, or to evaluate whether a CBDC would be appropriate for the United States. The United States, the Federal Reserve, has not made an official determination yet whether a CBDC would be appropriate for the United States. But regardless, I think it reflects the real understanding that digital assets are coming. They're coming one way or another. And so it's important for us to think through the implications for these different assets and how they could support US interests domestically and abroad. And so I'll stop there and open it up for questions or conversation, and happy to continue talking about any particular topic that you would like.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I would like to invite our members and guests to feel free to submit any questions in any of the manners that we have available right now. So we'll wait just a minute.
I can talk all day, but I'm happy to focus it on questions that your members may have in particular on the subject.
Yeah, maybe we could just go on a few more minutes and let some of our members get their thoughts together.
I see one question here from Gary. Are there forward markets and or hedging markets for cryptocurrencies? Yeah, the market space for cryptocurrencies is really interesting right now. There are forward markets, there are hedging markets, there are different instruments. We've seen in particular in the last year that banks and financial institutions are also now getting involved in cryptocurrency markets. They're seeing the market size and the market potential. And so they are starting to create new instruments. There are some synthetic hedges. I'm not aware of an explicit forwards contract specifically tied to one cryptocurrency in sort of the traditional sense. So this would be, something that would be traded in markets. But there are a lot of indices and there are a lot of synthetic instruments that are now being used as sort of a way to hedge against some of the volatility. It's probably important to mention, these cryptocurrencies right now are extremely volatile. I imagine several of you are focused primarily on Bitcoin. That's the largest. It has the largest market share. It's about 65% of the market share of cryptocurrencies, and its price goes all over the place. And so I think, there's a lot of interest in trying to hedge against the risks of that up and down movement in the currency. It's probably also important to mention, though, that for all of the hype and all of the talk about Bitcoin, it's still relatively small. Its market cap right now is under $200 billion. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket in terms of regular transactions that happen in the financial sector. And so it's still young, it's still volatile, but there are some emerging hedges and contracts that are out there. Got some good questions now coming in, so I like this. How the value of digital assets are determined, and is it universal? So this goes back to the first point I was making about money. What is the unit of account, right? The unit of account is how effectively you're pricing things. And I think what we're understanding right now, and the way the US government is looking at this, is right now, digital assets essentially function like a commodity. So think gold, think oil. That is, they're priced in dollars, they're volatile, and they're seen more as a store of value than as a genuine unit of account. Now, this may change with CBDCs in particular, because central banks are able to determine what counts and against what you're comparing assets and commodities. But right now, the price is determined mostly by transactions. It's mostly determined by how many people are using it, how many people are engaging in trades related to it. So I don't think we're going to see a standard unit of account among digital assets until central banks themselves make a determination about how they're going to engage in digital assets. Paul asks about credit card companies. Interest rates are practically zero. Oh, I just lost it here. Here we are. Computer transaction costs are so minimal. Yeah, so this is a key point. Why are credit card transaction fees so high? I mean, when you look at the US financial system, among the most profitable companies in the world are credit card companies. Part of this, I think, has to do with the culture. The United States is a credit card oriented country. That's how our ecosystem evolved. And it's interesting to compare the United States as it relates to credit cards or other digital assets or platforms with others around the world. And what you find is that the US often has higher transaction costs for regular day-to-day transactions than most other places, particularly those that are adopting peer-to-peer or other software solutions and platforms. Credit card companies are simply among the most profitable. And part of that, I think, has to do with some of the challenges related to regulations and AML, CFT, that is anti-money laundering and terrorist financing regulations. The Banking Secrecy Act has very strict standards as it relates to knowing your own customer. The benefits of credit card companies is that they're tied directly into banks, which have access to that private information that allows them to validate you are who you say you are. So if there are technologies and tools that enable us to truly validate who you are in a digital sphere, I think that would go the longest way to reducing the costs related to those transactions. Let's see here. Global efforts to curb or process cryptocurrencies. My sense right now is that the United States and our like-minded partners, particularly in Europe, we're technology neutral. That is, we don't want to pick and choose winners in this current wild west of new currencies and new ideas. And I think that's encouraging, because what that allows is for the best ideas to come out on top, and for the marketplace of ideas and innovation to play out and to find the winners. Now, it is true, and one of the concerns that we do have is that this is a winner-take-all type market. And so there are concerns about having one winner come and take the entire market share, and thereby creating some real macroeconomic stability questions. You saw this with the Libra, for example, when it was first proposed in 2019. And so I'm not sure exactly how it's going to play out, but for the moment, certainly the United States is technology neutral, and we really do want to try to avoid picking one company or one technological solution over another. We do ask, however, that any company that comes to market be sure that it addresses the money laundering, the financing of terrorism, the know your own customer regulations first and foremost. You can't operate first before you have those questions resolved. Question just came in about the IMF and the World Bank. What role do they have in regulating currencies? So our office coordinates very closely with the IMF on global macroeconomic issues, debt transparency, particularly right now in this COVID context, as we're working to help countries deal with various economic downturns as a result of COVID. And it's been interesting, IMF researchers have been doing a really good job of looking at how digital assets have played a role during COVID. And it's really encouraging, particularly in countries like Africa. Let me just pull up this statistic. I mean, in Rwanda, for example, at the very beginning of COVID, IMF researchers were showing that basically the use of digital currencies and digital transfers tripled overnight as Rwandan authorities cut the fees associated with online digital transactions. In terms of an explicit regulatory role, they do not have any. But the IMF has excellent expertise, and the World Bank as well, in helping countries and providing technical assistance to their regulators and to their government officials to come up with good solutions for within that specific country context. A question about China government's abrupt prevention of the Ant Financial public offering and its public humiliation of Jack Ma. You know, this is a really good example of exactly the risks that we're talking about. So we're kind of grateful to China for outlining just what is at stake right now in this emerging world of digital currency. For those who don't know, Ant Financial was going to have an initial public offering within China. It was going to be the largest IPO in history. Ant Financial is one of the largest digital payment platforms in China and in the world. And basically what happened is the Chinese government pulled it back and said, and called Jack Ma to attention. And we really see this as one of the risks of the Chinese example, which is you're always going to be subject to political influence. You're always going to be subject to the concerns of the party over the concerns of transparency and the international financial system. And so our argument really, in comparison and in contrast, is to say, let's develop an international system that is transparent, that is open, and that adheres to the best rigorous standards to prevent illicit actors from partaking in the system. The Federal Reserve, when they announced their research, for example, on a digital currency, said that all their code would be open source and available. We still have no idea what China's code looks like for its digital currency. And so I think that's a good example of the compare and contrast and the foreign policy implications that are at stake here as well. How to invest in Bitcoin? I'm not an investor, or I'm not a financial advisor. There's always that disclaimer. They say that, you know, don't ever listen to anyone. I think it's very difficult right now. And our perspective is that, especially when it comes to crypto, it's very much the Wild West. And as such, it is very, very risky. And I think it's challenging to think of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as an asset similar to gold or to oil. I know many do think of it that way. I'm personally skeptical. And the reason is, at the end of the day, Bitcoin is a distributed ledger, and its value is a function of other people believing in its value. Now, you could argue that's the exact same thing with fiat, and that's true. The difference being that fiat currency is backed by government, is a sovereign-backed asset. It's unclear to me whether Bitcoin fulfills or has any backing. And I'm sure if there are any Bitcoin purists, I've had many conversations with them, and they will argue this point forever, and I'm happy to discuss it more. But I think what I'm trying to articulate here is that it's still unknown. You know, when Bitcoin was first introduced, it was proposed to be a currency. But if we go back to those three definitions of what counts as money, I don't see it as a unit of account. I don't see it particularly good as a medium of exchange, as a store of value, perhaps. And I think that it remains to be seen. But I just don't think that it's there. I think there was a question related to what happens if you lose your access to your e-wallet. I mean, it's important to keep in mind, for example, there's 18.5 million Bitcoins right now in the world. Of those, 4 million are lost forever. People have lost their wallets. People have lost access to their accounts, and it's gone because it is a digital bearer instrument. So it's like the physical banknote, and if you lose it, you lose it. And the difference, though, is no one else can find it. And so, yeah, these are some questions I think related to the long-term sustainability of Bitcoin, why I'm personally a little skeptical there, and why I think it's going to be very interesting to take a look at central bank digital currencies in the next little bit as well. A question about the confiscation of cryptocurrency, legal authority. Again, I'm not a lawyer and I won't go down that, but I do think that cryptocurrency is a mixed bag when it comes to enforcement. That is, it can be difficult to trace, or it can be difficult to identify the agents involved. But once you know a name that is associated with the correct hash, you're able to follow the transaction. So on one level, digital assets provides an opportunity for radical transparency, for being able to literally follow the money at every step of the way. And we've seen that very successful in many prosecutions, starting with the Silk Road prosecution several years ago. And the means for seizing those assets are the same as seizing any other asset that is held by someone. But again, I'm not a lawyer and I won't go too much into the details there. What are the dangers that come with the disassociation and decentralization of cryptocurrency? And how might they be combated? That's a really good question. It's one that we really struggle with. Central bankers frequently raise the concern about disintermediation. That is, what happens when you take banks out of the mix? And you know, some have discussed having central bank digital currencies where individual citizens could have accounts at central banks, and they would be able to transact and, you know, withdraw and deposit money directly with the central bank. Currently, only select banks are able to have that ability with the bank. So we have that intermediate level between us and the ultimate money supply. Digital currencies could completely disintermediate that. And that's one of the real risks that I think keep central bankers up at night. The decentralized nature of a lot of these cryptocurrencies as well creates decentralized risks, right? Who do you point to? Who's the bad guy if a price is being manipulated? We've already seen in many cryptocurrency markets manipulation by various actors who are able to create price spikes and pump and dumps and other things like that by creating a coordinated bot that is decentralized. So it's no one person that is necessarily manipulating the spike, but rather it is a decentralized group. These are pretty significant risks. And I think they're one of the most unanswered aspects of those who are proposing decentralized assets over centralized assets. But that debate is ongoing. I don't know if we've seen really a winner or a loser between centralized versus decentralized assets. Question about a new cryptocurrency becoming the international reserve currency. This actually came from the Bank of England former governor had proposed in 2019 a synthetic digital hegemonic instrument, I believe is what he called it. And his idea was to suggest something that functioned as an international currency that wasn't the dollar. My immediate response is this has already been tried. It's called the special drawing rights at the IMF. We actually already have an international reserve, quote unquote, that is the IMF denominated currency. The reality is that it plays a very small role. And again, we go back to that first definition of what is money, a unit of account. No one is citing anything in SDR. And I think it would be extremely difficult to replace the US dollar in international transactions right now, simply because of the institutional value that the Federal Reserve has created over decades, right? I believe it was a French banker in the 1960s who called it the American exorbitant privilege. And that is genuinely the privilege that comes with having a credible monetary policy and a consistent monetary policy. So 90% of foreign exchange transactions have the dollar on one side. 80% of all trade is denominated in US dollars throughout the entire world. I think it's extremely difficult at this stage to think of a cryptocurrency supplanting the international role of the US dollar. It could be in the future. And I think that's a part of why the Federal Reserve and other central banks are looking at digital currencies now, to make sure that they are responsive to some of the demands that they're seeing from the marketplace right now. Seeing if I got through all these questions. Who controls the supply of cryptocurrencies when you contrast and compare from the fact that Fed and banks control the supply of dollars and use that to manage economic growth rates? Yeah, this is a key part of macroeconomic stability. Different cryptocurrencies have different approaches. So Bitcoin, just to use an example, is cryptographically constrained so that there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin in the world. In a sense, this is creating an implicit deflationary currency. So if Bitcoin were to become a currency, given that its supply was constrained, it would inevitably mean that the value of any one Bitcoin would increase over time. US governments and other governments do not have that constraint, right? And that is often the criticism, that value, the store of value, degrades over time because of inflation, because the Federal Reserve and the banks can always print more money, essentially, when needed. But I think it's important to recognize that you need a flexible supply. One of the great challenges of the gold standard and efforts to push for a silver standard had to do with the fact that the supply of money in the system was dependent entirely on the mining operations that sometimes yielded a lot of gold and sometimes yielded very little. The reality is economic activity ebbs and flows in a much more dynamic fashion. And so you want a currency to be more responsive. And I don't think private cryptocurrencies have really addressed that per se. Now, when it comes to central bank digital currencies, since it will be managed centrally by a central bank and will be considered essentially just like banknotes, I think there's a lot more opportunity there for them to add and subtract money in the system. Several European regulators have even decided to call it programmable money, because now you have the option where you could tie the interest rate directly to that asset. So imagine, instead of having a dollar bill in your wallet that is simply a dollar bill regardless of inflation or not, you could actually tie interest rate to that. So that dollar bill in your e-wallet becomes 105 next year if interest is 5%. And so the value of each instrument could actually ebb and flow as a function of inflation or as a function of monetary policy. So there are some interesting ideas there. As computers become more efficient, would we expect the electrical consumption of blockchain to improve? The quick answer is no. And part of the reason for that is the longer you have transactions, the longer the chain goes, right? So I was just looking at these statistics here. I think right now, the Bitcoin blockchain is 39 gigabytes. And every time a transaction takes place, you have to go through and validate every single aspect of that 39 gigabyte blockchain. And as a result, as more and more transactions go, it can become increasingly challenging to go through and validate that decentralized asset. One statistic that sort of blows my mind is that one Bitcoin transaction right now takes about 740 kilowatt hours of energy. And in comparison, 100,000 Visa transactions takes about 150 kilowatt hours. So 750 for one in Bitcoin and 100,000 transactions on the other side for 1/5 of the electricity consumption. I think this is a fundamental flaw in Bitcoin. Personally, I think the considerations of efficiency and energy efficiency have not been considered enough. And also it slows down the transactions. And so the throughput for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is actually relatively poor. And we talk about immediate clearance of payments, and you're not necessarily seeing that, at least with the current models that we see with cryptocurrencies. A lot of research remains to be done. Perhaps computers become more efficient, but there's a bit of a race going on here where the transaction complexity increases at an exponential rate, and you have to have computer processing efficiency increase at the same rate or better in order to keep up. There are some interesting, intriguing ideas related to quantum computing and to some of these more impressive transactions, but then you get into the problem that those computers can process so quickly that they could crack the blockchain. One of the great arguments about cryptocurrency is that they're unbreakable, that the cryptographic encoding of these blockchains is so complex that no computer could hack into that chain and invalidate or change the transactions. There is some potential concerns that quantum computing and more advanced computing could actually break that. And then you would have some serious security concerns. Questions related to the 5 basket of international currencies, and a question of if China becomes a member of the 5 basket of currencies some 12 years ago. I think this is a question from Jim Allen. I think what this is referring to is the IMF basket of currencies that they use to weight the SDR, the special drawing rights. And indeed, I believe China was added in 2011, if I remember correctly, maybe a little bit later. I'd have to go back and look at that. But yes, so international currencies that are used in international trade is the standard by which the IMF includes currencies in its SDR basket. In other words, the value of SDR is a weighted value of the key currencies used in international transactions. I think right now it functions well for the purposes of the IMF and its cooperation with countries, particularly as it's helping support debt relief and restructuring, not debt relief, but rather debt sustainability for these countries, enabling them to develop a sustainable macroeconomic path. I don't think it, at this stage, has much of a larger role within international financial markets. SDR is kind of one of those esoteric things that very few people really know about in a day-to-day context. And China's inclusion, or the RMB's inclusion in this basket of currencies made waves at the time. And yes, I think there is some concern and interest in efforts in China to internationalize its currency, to have it used more and more as a means of avoiding US actions and the use of the US dollar. But there's a bit of a catch there. If you internationalize your currency, you have to be prepared for open capital markets. You have to be able to allow money to come in and out whenever it wants to. That's again one of the great advantages of the US dollar, is our extremely open capital markets. China and the Chinese Communist Party has no intention, as far as we know, of ever liberalizing its capital markets, because then you lose control of a lot. And the United States long ago said that transparency and openness mattered more. And indeed, I think that's been borne out, that you see a more open economy and a more opportunities as a result of those open capital markets. And that's what allows the dollar to be internationalized as well. So I'm again skeptical about China's efforts to internationalize its currency because of the risks that would be entailed in opening its capital accounts. But again, I'm not an expert, so I won't go too into the details there. How does a holder of Bitcoin convert it into government fiat currencies like euros or dollars? This is again one of those weak links, I would say, in the current cryptocurrency digital asset world. In order to do so, you need brokers or you need exchanges. And those exchanges have very frequently been the site of significant thefts and significant security concerns. So the way that Bitcoin and other of these cryptocurrencies work is you have your unique identifier. You have the string of symbols and objects that indicate you are the owner and holder of this particular wallet in which you are holding Bitcoin or something else. You have to retain that, and you have to keep that secure. Now, it's very complicated, and for the regular user, I don't think many people are very comfortable keeping this long code. So many companies have emerged that enable an exchange to hold on to your e-wallet, to manage transactions, and to actually exchange it out. I will say that, and there are 7,800 or so ATMs right now in which you can put in your identifier and take money out from your Bitcoin account and things like that. So there are technologies and solutions, but then the moment you input your information, it's subject to risk and theft. And we've seen many of these exchanges close down for fraud, for straight up stealing the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies out of the account. And unfortunately, once it's gone, it's gone. There's no recovering of it. Just like if a thief came into your home and took that money under your mattress, it's gone. There's no means of recovering at all. And so it begs the question, so what's the real advantage then of some of these digital currencies? And it goes back to the debate I mentioned about, is this a bearer instrument or is this an account instrument? Is this a claim instrument? And so if it's a claim instrument, meaning you have a bank account and or you have a credit card, which is a claim, and someone steals your credit card and uses that credit card, you have a claim that you can go and work that out with the company to recover, versus if someone comes in and takes the money, there's very little that you can do about it. So I think that's an interesting and unresolved aspect of digital currency that I don't think we've really gotten to at this point. Is the value of the digital asset guaranteed, and if so, by whom? There are currently 8,700 different digital assets that I'm aware of. There's probably more. They're coming and going all the time. They have a lot of different models. I'll just mention two in particular as interesting models. I mentioned a little bit about stable coins. What I mean by a stable coin are these are coins, these are digital currencies that claim to be backed by fiat currency. So there's a couple of examples where they are pegged directly to the US dollar. So there's one called the US digital coin, and one US digital coin equals $1 US. And they claim that that asset is backed at all times by the company's bank account that keeps an equal amount of US dollars as it has coins in circulation. In other words, they're trying to essentially digitally convert dollars so that they can be used in a digital sphere. I'm skeptical. For those who may know a little bit about Latin American history, Argentina tried to do something essentially similar when they created currency boards. That was, they established an exchange rate regime in which they had $1 US in circulation, essentially, for every Argentinian dollar that was in the market. For those who know the 2001 and other crises, it didn't work out so well because, again, the credibility of the underlying institution is the key issue to keep in mind. And the US dollar is backed by the US government. The US digital coin is not backed by the US government. It's backed by the faith that you have in that company that is offering you that currency or offering you that asset. And so for that reason, again, I think right now it's very speculative. And it's very much in that early phase of trying out new business models, and having a stable coin that is backed explicitly by a fiat currency is one way to guarantee it. The other model is essentially the Bitcoin model, which says that it's not backed by anything, but it's backed by everything at the same time. That is, the entire network functions as a way of digitally verifying and validating every transaction. But the value is only a function of if everyone believes in it. As we've seen in other market runs and crises, everyone can believe in something and then the next day they don't. And how do you deal with the volatility in that animal spirit that has often driven the panics and the booms and bust cycles that we see in regular economies? I don't believe that cryptocurrencies or digital assets are immune from that boom bust cycle. If anything, they might be more vulnerable since you can move large quantities of currency and of assets in an extremely short period of time. I mean, at least in the Great Depression, you actually had to go to the bank and physically take money out. Now I can put $1 billion on a USB relatively easily. And so I think there's unanswered questions still about who backs these currencies and what happens in a true crisis. how are these assets able to be sustained in moments of real panic? Okay, Bill's challenging me, and I'm glad he asked this because this is important. He said, well, why is this a State Department topic instead of a Treasury topic? I will be very explicit here to say this is very much a Department of Treasury topic. And please, if you talk to Department of Treasury colleagues, I do want to emphasize they have the lead for the US government when it comes to policy as it relates to digital assets, particularly domestically in the United States. And so at all times, the Department of Treasury is our lead when it comes to monetary policy. The State Department angle, though, is where we're trying to connect to some of these foreign policy implications as it relates to our partners, as it relates to how the world is changing and what this means for US foreign policy. So what I'm trying to do, and what the State Department is trying to do from our side, is look at this technological evolution and say, what does this mean for us? And so just to give you a few examples of where this is really, the rubber is meeting the road. I mentioned the Bahamas before, and I'll just go back to it for a moment. The Bahamas is piloting the sand dollar that enables them to reach communities and far-flung islands and engage and participate in the formal financial system. We see that as extremely beneficial for one of our near neighbors. That enables them to include more, to reduce corruption, because now transactions with the state can be conducted in a digitally verifiable manner. It reduces the opportunities for theft by state actors. And so we see that as a really encouraging way that we could potentially get closer together with them. Similarly, many Caribbean countries are currently piloting or exploring the pilot for a digital currency. Many of these countries already use the US dollar. And in times past, instability in inflation and in their macroeconomic stability has created foreign policy problems that have come to redound back on the United States. So a mechanism by which we could have a more stable Caribbean neighborhood would be in the US foreign policy interests. And then on the other side, we're very concerned about how some of these tools could be used to manipulate international financial systems and undermine US influence throughout the world. And so I've mentioned China already, and that is our #1 concern, both because it's clear that their intention is not to create a stable international platform, but rather to promote its own interests. But another example as well is Russia. Russia is subject to a variety of sanctions by the US government right now, and what are known as secondary sanctions. That is, any actor who wishes to participate in the US financial system cannot also simultaneously engage with particular transactions in Russia or with the Russian government. So they've tried to create alternatives using digital assets and digital currencies. They're finding it's very difficult. And going back to my original point, we really do see the US dollar as a key instrument of stability and transparency throughout the world. And so they're running up against the difficulty that no one really wants to engage in an alternative platform created by Russia. You saw something similar in Venezuela, where the Maduro regime tried to develop its own cryptocurrency, the Petro, in order to avoid US sanctions and avoid using the US dollar in oil transactions. Both have been pretty much failures. And that's encouraging, I think, because it shows the value of the US dollar and the value of US influence throughout the world. But it's something we need to keep an eye on, because obviously the world's changing and we need to stay abreast of that as it relates to US foreign policy. I think I got through the questions. So really excellent questions. Really, I liked all of them. If there are any more.
Yeah, that was quite a run through. There were a lot of questions that were answered. So thank you, Andrew. So yes, we do have a little bit more time. If anybody has some questions that they'd like to ask before we finish up for the day, we'd love to hear them. Okay, Jim Allen has raised his hand. Jim, do you want to speak or do you want to type your question in? Jim, go ahead if you'd like to.
Can you hear now?
Absolutely.
Okay, my question relates to a sidebar to the question about the 5 international currencies, of which China is one. Is there a way that the China lobbied, as I understand it, for 10 or 12 years to get into the international basket of currencies? So therefore they wanted to get in. And then you have to maintain certain financial standards, financial health standards to stay in the international basket of currencies. So is there a way that our foreign policy or our international trading activities can be used to get leverage over China about their activities in South China Sea or whatever we want to argue about with them, and try to change their behavior because they aren't meeting certain standards to stay into the basket of currencies? And I don't understand all the details in my question, but is there a way that the desire of the Chinese to stay in the basket of currencies could be used to the advantage of the United States or other free Western countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the inclusion of the Chinese renminbi in the SDR basket was controversial at the time. It was also at a time when China was attempting to internationalize its currency. So it did explicitly attempt for about a year to have more international trade denominated in RMB, to encourage its partners to engage in that. And I shouldn't be too dismissive, because we do still see some of this trend. For example, China has extended what are known as swap currency swaps with many countries around the world. And so they are trying to have the RMB out there as a tool for its own foreign policy, just as the US dollar is a tool for foreign policy in the United States as well. To your specific question, the way that the basket is determined, in my understanding, is it's reviewed every 5 years by the IMF. My understanding is that that review primarily focuses on the macroeconomic stability within the country. So just sort of looking at the overall stability, and then its use in international transactions. It does not tie to an explicit political event or a political outcome. And for that, and I will say the IMF is very hesitant to be involved in political or politically motivated discussions. They really try to focus on their primary mission, which is global macroeconomic stability. And so I don't see a role in that aspect. But one thing that we can consider is what we're actually experiencing and seeing right now in the terms of COVID. So just as an example, China is the largest official debtor to most of the developing world right now, even more so than the United States or other so-called Paris Club members. They have been lending extensively to all of these countries for many years in opaque and non-transparent lending practices. Well, now that's coming home to roost, and these countries are really starting to experience the difference between transparent lending and non-transparent lending, and they're struggling. So Zambia, for instance, right now is in a restructuring deal with China, and suddenly discovering that China doesn't play fair. And I think honestly that China's own behavior is the best argument against or to pressure other countries to think about this, and simply showing what they do with the power and influence they have is probably the strongest rhetorical tool we have going forward. Now, in terms of including SDR in the basket, you know, there is some discussions I know about whether or not to include RMB or not in global trade. But it's important to mention right now, last I looked, it was about 2.5% of global transactions outside of China occur using RMB. And so it's really insignificant. And so I don't want to overstate their influence in international financial transactions at this time. Now, that can change, and it's something that we need to be very vigilant about. So it's something we'll continue to look at.
I see we have a chat. Okay, this just is from Marina. She's had to run off, so not a question. Any other further questions? All right, well, with that, I just would like to express our thanks to you. I think it was a fascinating program, and I can see that our participants got quite a bit out of it, and we're very engaged by it. So Thank you to Andrew, and thank you to the State Office of Monetary Affairs for hosting this. To everybody else, I'd just like to say and remind you that our next speaker series webinar is December 1st. We will be hosting former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who will speak to us on topics related to his new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. Based on your preference, we will be offering either an in-person event with a luncheon registration or a webinar-only access. So for more information, please check our website at csworldaffairs.org. Hold on, I may have, there we go. Thanks so very much, and thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, that was fun.
That was fun. Thank you. Everybody stay safe. Bye-bye.